Okay, so that's everyone in through from the waiting room, is it?
Yep, so far.
Continue to let people in as they arrive, but let's get the discussion going. So, hello everyone. I'm Christina McDonald. I am the host of the CIOOS Atlantic discussion series titled Exploring Ways to Bring Together Indigenous and Western Knowledge Systems for Coastal and Ocean Observing. And I am speaking to you today from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So here in the Maritimes, we are actually in the middle of a winter storm. So there is a possibility that we'll have power outage that affects this virtual discussion. But Pisces Research Project Management is helping us run this series, and their fantastic team has put a number of backups in place to try and keep things running. But if everything does come to a crashing halt, I'll be in touch regarding rescheduling this discussion to a later date. And a number of people, including some of our guest speakers, are zooming in from across the continent and around the world, and you may all be dealing with similar weather conditions or limited connectivity. And there are phone-in options that were included with the Eventbrite invitation in the event that your internet goes down. So please do consider the phone-in. So today's discussion is the second in a three-part series. The first discussion took place on January 19th, and there, Katherine Martin, the Director of Community Indigenous Engagement for Dalhousie University, welcomed us to Mi'kma'ki, and Elder Albert Marshall and Elder Edward Purley shared their knowledge and called on every one of us to step into our inherent responsibility to care for the planet and not compromise it for the generations who come after us. A recording of this discussion is available on the CIOOS Atlantic YouTube channel, and we are very honored that Elder Edward Purley has joined us again today for this conversation. And I do believe that Elder Albert Marshall has just been brought in as well too. So very honored that both Elder Albert and Elder Edward are also here again today for this conversation. Before we turn to the discussion today, a few quick housekeeping notes regarding the Zoom platform we are using. Kieran, would you mind walking us through that now, please?
Yes, of course. Just the next slide, please. Alrighty, so there is no wrong entry for questions. We have three ways for taking questions. You can either post directly into the chat, just going into the Zoom options bar at the bottom and clicking chat and typing your question and then hitting send. Or you can raise your Zoom hand, which will raise a little blue hand on the screen and we will know how to take your question. We'll make sure that you're next in line. Or you can unmute directly using the unmute and mute button in the corner, again in your options bar. And you can also toggle your video on and off if you so choose. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me, Olivia, or Daniel, and we will be able to help you.
Thanks, Kieran. And I see that you've popped in some phone-in options into the chat there. So if you're feeling like your internet is wobbling, take note of those call-in options. So the session today will run approximately 2 hours and it will be concluding at 3 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. This discussion series is made possible through the generous support of the Ocean Frontier Institute and Canada's Ocean Supercluster. And we are going to be recording the discussion so that anyone unable to participate in the session today can view it later online. So I am pleased now to turn things over to Katherine Martin to welcome us and welcome greetings from those of you in attendance who would like to share them. And for this particular part of the discussion, I do encourage you to unmute yourselves. You all have that capacity and share your greetings should you choose to do so. So Katherine, please take it away.
Kwe, Ningadalina Multi, and it's a beautiful day to me because I love the storms. And if if we lose each other, just try to find a way to get back on. I think you could call in if you're off on your video. It's an honor to be back again with our elder Edward Pearlie and Albert Marshall, Dr. Albert Marshall. We enjoyed our time last week, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy the speakers today. We welcome everybody to the unceded territory of our ancestors, the Olnu, or what we know today as Mi'kmaq. And I'm here right on the Atlantic Ocean, watching the Mother Earth do her thing and Grandmother Moon get those tides moving. So it's always been a part of our customs since time immemorial, over 14,000 years, to welcome people to share our land on our unceded territory that was reaffirmed by our ancestors of 1752, 1725, 1763, who signed a peace and friendship treaty that said that we as Olnu can continue to live as we always have and always will, and that we would let the new immigrants, the British and the French and anyone after that, to come and share in our land as well, as long as we all respect and accept that this is our territory, and we love sharing with all cultures. So in keeping with that, I'm going to sing a chant that Sarah Denny of Eskasoni, the home of Dr. Albert Marshall, taught to me. She said, sing this whenever you're greeting people, celebrating, whenever you're gathering nations. And it's a welcome chant, a feast chant, which is an appropriate time to sing today because we are entering into the midwinter feast time of our people. And many Indigenous peoples around the Turtle Island are doing the same. When we thank the spirits and our Creator for giving us all the food and the nourishment and the meat and fish that we needed to get through to halfway through the winter. And so we have ceremony, we feed the spirits, we thank them, and we thank our relatives, the animals, the fish, the trees, the plants, all those that have given their lives to us in order for us to survive. And we ask that we get through the rest of the winter as we've been given that honor by Mother Earth and the Creator. The heartbeat of the drum represents the heartbeat of Mother Earth and our own mother. We all know this. So I'm always taught that when I'm here, when I'm speaking, to speak from my heart, because that's a teaching from us, but it's also the truth, because it's the heart language, the language of our mother. And we all know it. If we speak from our heart, we can all understand one another. One no day, one no day, one no day, one no danai, one nalia, one no danai, one nalia, one no danai, one nalia, one no day. Guanalia, guanode. Guanalia, guanoda. Ego, igane. Ego, igana. Guanalia, guanodana. Guanalia, guanodana. Wanalia guano de. Wanalia guano de. Wanalia guano da. Deyoka, deyoka. Deyoka, deyoka. Wanalia guano danai. Wanalia guano danai. Wanalia guano de. Wanalia guano de. Wanalia guano da. Daho. Emsit Nokama. I also reminded, as I was drumming, of a very special friend of ours, the groundhog, because today is February 2nd and it's called Groundhog Day to many people. And here in Unamagi, in our territory, we have a beautiful community called Sibanekittik, and it's called Shubenacadie for those who might remember that. And there in Shubenacadie is a wildlife park. And in that wildlife park is a very famous groundhog who comes and lets us know whether we're going to have a short winter or a long winter. And so today, Shubenacadie Sam popped out and did not see the shadow and is assuring us that means that we are going to have a short winter or an early spring. At this time, I would love to invite anybody for the next 5 minutes who want to bring greetings from their territory to please go on to chat and we will hear you, or turn on your mic and we'll let that happen for the next 5 minutes. Anyone want to try? Anywhere you are.
I believe Elder Albert Marshall would like to share.
Okay.
Albert, please take yourself off mute.
I would like to bring greetings from the East. Since we are the ones that have been here the longest, but unfortunately, the task that was given to us was taken away from us. We were assigned to be the gatekeepers, but unfortunately, that responsibility was taken away from us, and we lost control. Because everyone that came to our territory had to agree to live by the principles in which how our people were able to sustain themselves for thousands and thousands of years. And eventually those were actually referred to as Ankugamkewe, the treaties. And as these people were arriving, they were, first of all, they were welcomed, and then they were made to agree that if they are going to live here, then they have to abide some of the principles like Nidugulink, in which as they will be going about how they go about their sustaining themselves, they will not in any shape or form compromise the ecological integrity of the area. And then they would always pledge that they would always use the gifts and knowledge that the Creator has given all of us to be used for the ones that cannot defend themselves in human form. But anyway, and the other thing that really struck me was Kathy was singing that song. I don't know how many people know the history of it. We got part of that from the Haudenosaunee And the last renewal of that treaty happened in 1919 in Chapel Island, in which that chant was sung because the Haudenosaunee was here. But somehow that chant went dormant. It never resurfaced again until when that year, I don't know what year it was, but a National Film Board did a documentary on the Aboriginals, supposedly pre-contact, trying to depict how our people were living. I'm sure a lot of people, I'm sure Kathy might remember it. It was called the Mi'kmaq series. That was the time that this chant was brought out again. And there was only one man. His name was Michael Paul, Michael Cheese, we used to call him. Mescasoni here. He had it. And he sang, and he sang that song at one of the sessions. Fortunately, I have the drum that was used in 1919, and the drum that was used when that chant was sung during that filming of the Mi'kmaq series. So this drum has, if this drum could only speak. And I think the reason why I'm saying this is because our culture could remain dormant for a while and then come back again, especially something like this. And I don't know what the theme of our discussion here is going to be, but I believe it's about traditional knowledges. Well, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that every culture has traditional knowledge. But what we should be referring to here, though, is a Mi'kmaq traditional. That's the only knowledge that I can refer to. And this traditional knowledge has been passed on to us from our ancestors without any deviation of it. Because one good thing that what our forefathers left for us was that they made sure that our traditions will only be transmitted orally. And when we look at it, when we look at that concept today, when you recite any part of that oral tradition, you make sure that you repeat what was said, not what you heard. Because I believe if it had been just the opposite of that, our oral traditions could be very much, the interpretation could have been very much different than what they are now. Because as an individual, we have a strong tendency to repeat what we heard and just continuously add on our own personal interpretations or personal opinions. So this is why I believe our culture is just as strong and relevant as it was then. And I certainly hope that this will continue. But however, now since we are no longer oral, and now we are pretty much function on a written text, I like to suggest that maybe, we should start to somehow embrace some mechanisms of ensuring that this traditional knowledge will not be deviating in the future, that the essence of it, the way it was delivered, will always be transmitted in the same way, so that the interpretation will always remain as it was intended to be. Thank you.
Well, Alan, is there anyone else that would like to offer a greeting from your territory? Max? Oh, no, sorry, Max is just entering the waiting room. Well, anybody else? One more call. Do we have somebody from New Zealand here again this time? No? Okay. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and thanks so much, Albert, for speaking. It's always a pleasure. And I was also told the chant was a feast chant, and because it's a midwinter feast, and it's actually Medina and Albert that taught this to me, and I actually have done a lot to revive the midwinter feast. And I'd like to say that chant is also sung during the feast of when we eat, when we gather, when we come together to share this sacred knowledge. So Walalin, Walaliok, and we'll let Christina take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Albert. And thank you all for joining us today. Similar to the first discussion, we have people tuning in from across the continent and around the world, and we have diverse representation from governments, from universities, including students, non-governmental organizations, and industry. So the focus of the panel discussion today is on the legal, ethical, and value considerations that surround digitizing and sharing Indigenous knowledge and data. Our four panelists today have a wealth and diversity of experience on this topic, and I am very much looking forward to introducing them to you shortly and getting the discussion going. But before I do that, I wanted to briefly speak to why this topic is important to CIOOS Atlantic. CIOOS Atlantic is committed to engaging with Indigenous peoples and exploring if there are meaningful and respectful ways that we can help each other and our oceans, which are in crisis, through sharing knowledge. There are important considerations when digitizing and sharing Indigenous knowledge. And to educate ourselves about these things, CIOOS Atlantic conducted a literature review to look at case studies where Indigenous knowledge was digitized, the factors that enabled successful outcomes, and the risks and limitations involved in the digitization of Indigenous knowledge, including traditional ecological knowledge. Mary Jane Prue, our fantastic former research assistant, was unable to join us today to speak to her work, but the literature review and her PowerPoint presentation with audio are both available on the CIOOS Atlantic website. This research was largely desktop, and it's missing the voices of the people here in Atlantic Canada and in other parts of the world who are immersed in this kind of work. And so that is why CIOOS Atlantic has organized this discussion series, which brings us to our panel today. How is this panel discussion going to work? Each one of our guests will take a few minutes to share their opening remarks. I've prepared 3 questions to guide the discussion for the next hour. And then we've allocated 20 minutes for an audience Q&A after the panel discussion. But if you have a burning question that just can't wait, please enter it into the chat and I will try and take it. And if you can remember to include your name and your title or organization along with your question, that would really help out. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to now take a few minutes to introduce each one of our 4 guest speakers. And I don't know, Kieran or Daniel, when I introduce each one of our 4 guest speakers, whether you can spotlight them. I know Stephanie was having some technical difficulties, so her video may not be on, but I'm now going to start with Stephanie. Dr. Stephanie Russo Carroll is an Ahtna and Sicilian descent woman who is a citizen of the native village of Klutika in Alaska. She is assistant professor of public health and associate director for the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. Stephanie's research explores the links between Indigenous governance, data, the environment, and community wellness. Stephanie led the publication of the CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Governance, which provide critical considerations for non-tribal entities that steward and use Indigenous peoples' data. And I'm just going to hold off on those slides momentarily, Daniel, until I've introduced the other three guest speakers. Thanks. So welcome, Stephanie. And if we can do whatever you would like to show your appreciation for Stephanie, that would be wonderful. Our next guest speaker is Christine Mcrae. Christine is a woman of the Madawaska River Algonquin people of the Crane clan. Christine owns two Indigenous knowledge-based companies, the Wasaya Consulting and Wasaya Cultural Tours. She is the executive director of Native Land Digital, an Indigenous-led Canadian not-for-profit organization that fosters conversations about the history of colonialism, Indigenous ways of knowing, and settler Indigenous relations. One of the resources that Native Land has developed is a crowdsourced, interactive map that marks the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples in the Americas and other parts of the world. Christine is currently pursuing her MA in Indigenous Studies at Trent University. Welcome, Christine. Next is Joel Heath. Joel is the executive director and co-founder of the Arctic Eider Society. He has worked and lived in Sanikiluaq, Nunavut since 2002 to support community priorities for capacity building. He has helped develop a network of community-driven research programs, curriculum for Northern schools, directed and produced a 16 times award-winning film, People of a Feather, and most recently developed online and mobile technology for Inuit self-determination in research through CIOOS, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network, which was a winner of the Google.org Impact Challenge in Canada. In 2020, Joel was nominated and selected for the Ashoka Fellowship, a network of the world's leading social entrepreneurs whose work improves the lives of peoples across the globe. And our fourth guest speaker, welcome, Joel. My apologies, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. And our fourth guest speaker is Ken Paul. Ken is a member of the Maliseet First Nation at Tobique, New Brunswick, and is a dedicated father of two. In October 2020, Ken accepted the role with the Wolastoqey Nation of New Brunswick as lead fisheries negotiator and fisheries research coordinator. He directly supports 6 Wolastoqey First Nations who were beneficiaries of the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1752 and 1760-61, which were affirmed by the Marshall Decision. Ken is the Director of Fisheries for the Assembly of First Nations, where he is responsible for supporting First Nation chiefs and regional organizations in legislation, advocacy, and research on inland fisheries, commercial fisheries, oceans governance, and aquaculture on a national and international level. So welcome, Ken, and welcome to all 4 of our guest speakers. It's a real honor to have you all here today. So that concludes a lot of my speaking for the time being. What I would now like to do is open it up to each one of our guest speakers to share a few opening remarks. And we're going to be starting with Stephanie. So Stephanie, the mic is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Christine, Catherine, Elder, Albert Marshall, CIOOS, and other panelists. It's an honor to be here today. Sidak Atmakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Stas, Landak Nalchina. Hello, I'm Stephanie Carroll, I'm Atna. And I am here paying my respects to the Tohono Nation and the Yaqui peoples on whose unceded territories I live and work in Tucson or Tucson, Arizona. Apologies to everybody for not using my video. I'm one of the peoples who are experiencing connectivity issues here today. I'm going to focus my remarks, if you can put up the slides now, Daniel. Thank you very much, on Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. So within our data systems today, Indigenous peoples' data comprise information and knowledge about the environment, land, skies, waters, communities, and non-humans with which we have relations. Information about us as individuals, such as health data, and information and knowledge about us as collective, as Indigenous peoples. So that can be our traditional cultural knowledge, our cultural sites, and more. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern knowledges and data from generation and storage to use and reuse. The Global Indigenous Data Alliance released the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, which are, you see here as collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, ethics in 2019. The CARE principles are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance across contemporary data ecosystems. So as Elder Albert Marshall noted, we need mechanisms to guide this inclusion of knowledge within data systems, and the CARE principles bring a people on purpose orientation to data governance and are concerned with inserting Indigenous provenance, protocol, and permissions across the data lifecycle. Next slide, Daniel, please. The CARE principles are designed to be complementary to the FAIR principles, which set forth criteria to make data findable, accessible, and interoperable and reusable. Making data both CARE and FAIR promotes equitable participation and outcomes from data access, use, reuse, and attribution. Implementation of the CARE and FAIR principles should be seen as a dimension of open data that ensures the use of data is purposeful and enhances the well-being of Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. Enacting the CARE principles applies across the data lifecycle. For instance, practicing CARE and data collection requires defining cultural metadata and recording provenance. Engaging CARE and data stewardship necessitates using appropriate governance models and making data fair. Less clear and needing more explanation or exploration are how to implement CARE in the data community and how to use FAIR with CARE and data applications. Next slide, please. Currently used mechanisms that can reflect and enact the CARE principles include tribal data governance tools such as tribal codes, guidelines, research review processes, and data sharing agreements. Tools employed by other institutions include guidelines, policies, and practices such as repository policies that require proof of permission from Indigenous peoples to deposit data and set forth the responsibilities and protocols for use of that data in the future. And infrastructure tools such as metadata labels and collection notices. But more tools and mechanisms are needed, as well as criteria to assess and evaluate how these other institutions can enact the CARE principles. So right now, to reinforce the operational of the CARE principles, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and other collaborators and initiatives are supporting co-production of policies, practices, and tools to implement CARE. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Next up, we are going to hear, gosh, I've lost my order. I believe we're going to hear from Christine next. Christine. Thank you.
Kwayani, Bojo, Christina Dishnaka, Smeros Kazibi, Donjaba, Ajijak and Dodem, Omamunani Nashnabi Kwandao. Hello, everyone. My name is Christine. So as Christina had mentioned, I am here in the capacity of Executive Director of Native Land Digital, but as well have a few other things on the go, including full-time graduate studies, and I also have two of my own companies. So kind of thinking of why I am here and what I can tell you about myself to kind of bring a connection. First thing is that I'm a graduate of Acadia. I spent 5 years of my life in Nova Scotia, so Mcrae, and I consider it kind of like a second home. It's a very special place in my life. So the focus of my work in general, in whatever capacity, is really centered on Indigenous health and Indigenous resurgence based on connection to ancestral land and ancestral practice. I do want to say miigwech to Elder Albert Marshall, Elder Edward Purley, and also to Katherine Martin for sharing their knowledge and songs during our first session a few weeks ago. I do want to say miigwech to Kyle Napier and Lena Minifee, as well as Victor Temprano from Native Land Digital for helping me to prepare, as well as to Christina and CIOOS for inviting me to participate, and Christina for being a wonderful person to engage in conversation with over the past few months. So miigwech for the invitation here. Further, following the January 19th discussion, the words that Elder Edward Purley talked about to really include all of our relations is something that has been at the forefront of my mind. And I was thinking a lot about our water system. So where I am coming to you from is kind of the middle of Ontario at the headwaters of the Madawaska River system. And the Madawaska River being a tributary to the Ottawa, which is then connected to the St. Lawrence River, and then it flows out into the Atlantic Ocean. So we're all connected through the water systems, and really what happens here eventually ends up in Big Ma'aki. So I'm very conscious of the responsibility that we have here in this territory to care for our waters here, because they will come to you as well. But further, I was lucky to spend a few years of my life studying American eel and Kitchissippi Pimisi, as we call it here. Here in the Madawaska River system, it's kind of the furthest extent that the females, or one of the furthest extents that the females come to spend the majority of their life. And at one time, American eel were extremely prevalent in our water systems, but given the construction of hydroelectric facilities, you know, the species has faced a 99% decline in population, and they're no longer present in our territory anymore. So that means that my generation, we do not know this animal. It's not part of our lives the same way that it would have been. But we do still have a number of elders who are able to share those stories with us. I was able to spend time with them and hear their stories about the ways that eel skin could be used to even help to set a broken bone, the ways that it was, the ways that they would have been cleaned, the way that they would have been cooked, and just the fact that they were so prevalent here. And thinking about this in kind of the more general context is that in knowing that those relations are no longer here because of some of the activities that are ongoing in our water systems, I look at the impact that that has on not only my generation, but rather the generations that are going to come after me. So really, I think that it's a bit of an example of what Elder Edward was talking about. Like this is why we need to advocate for all of our relations. It's because we have a responsibility to uphold those relationships and to really take care of each other. So really, I'm honored to be here today to share the little bit of knowledge that I have, and to share my words alongside of Stephanie, Joel, and Ken. So Chimigwich, everyone.
Thank you, Christine. Over to you, Joel.
Hi, it's a real privilege to be here. My name is Joel. I'm the Executive Director of Arctic Irish Society in Senakilawak, Nunavut. This is my 20th winter that I've had the privilege to be out on the ice with Inuit hunters and learning from them. And we're going to focus a little bit. Our charity kind of does three main pillars around community-driven research, helping support jobs addressing local community priorities, including things like impacts of hydro projects and climate change, helping bring in expertise and employment, and hiring hunters and youth using their skills to do that. Also helping develop curriculum using data collected by hunters to help teach math and science in northern schools, and have Inuit youth be the next generation of researchers and Inuit leaders. And also environmental stewardship, helping bring together Inuit and Cree communities for James Bay and Hudson Bay region. And I'm going to focus today on our CIOOS app, which is a tool that we've helped create to address a lot of those different needs and help serve those purposes. And you know, a lot of it initially came about, we were wanting to help mobilize data for 5 different communities working together and have a way for them to share their knowledge across the geographies, and to be able to collaborate and to be able to own their data. And there had been a lot of conversations in the academic community about, you know, how can we have a platform that's going to help centralize services, and every academic research project wanted to have their own platform and had different needs. And it was clear there was never going to be one platform. And then Inuit had created a lot of groups on social media, like Nunavut Hunting Stories of the Day, where they were sharing their information, but it was kind of, from an intellectual property perspective, it was really kind of a worst case scenario where you're giving up the rights to your photos and you can never mobilize your knowledge. Like if you wanted to find a post that you made last year, or you'd be scrolling for a week to try and find it, there was no way to mobilize that. And alongside that, one of our elders here in Senekilluaq, Peter Katuk, really helped inspire it. He was using the example about seals, and he was noticing a change in the diets from fish to shrimp. And you know, he was out at the flow edge every single day, noticing that. And you know, he mentioned that to academics, and you know, that's interesting. But the traditional response from academics was that, you know, it's interesting, but it's qualitative or it's anecdotal, and we need the data to prove it. And then researchers would spend 5 years trying to prove what Inuit had already told them was true, and then they spent a bunch of time and money, and then they're back to the same place where they now see, okay, you weren't lying. And it was based on this kind of writing off Inuit knowledge as being qualitative or anecdotal. And you know, when Peter was out there every single day, every day he caught a seal, he had a new data point, and he was discussing it with other hunters and elders in a form of peer review. And the real difference was that, you know, Inuit knowledge has been based on oral history, and it's only recently that there's even been a written language. And so, and scientists are like excruciatingly good at writing down things in a lot of detail. And so the inspiration from Peter was that, you know, if he took a picture every time of the stomach contents and was able to tag the food in the stomach the same way as you can tag a person on Facebook, then the data that's always been behind his knowledge would be able to be mobilized for the benefit of Inuit. And he would have that same data set to show people that he based his analysis and his interpretation on. And so to help kind of overcome that and empower. And that doesn't mean all forms of Indigenous knowledge are quantitative, but in many cases there are a lot of data and observations that are quantitative behind it. And so that was the idea with the CIOOS mobile app, an online platform. And I can talk a little bit more about how that inspiration kind of helped shape, you know, the ethical considerations around not having it be a platform that was created by researchers, but a platform that was created by and for Inuit that first and foremost lets them have full ownership and control how they share it. And so it's not citizen science. It looks like a citizen science platform, but the difference is it's about self-determination, and Inuit own their own data, and they can choose to share it with researchers if they want to, and they have full control over that. And so I'd be happy to talk more about that in a bit.
Thank you, Joel. And we have a short film that we can show now too about CIOOS.
CIOOS, the Inuktitut word for sea ice, connects communities across the Arctic. CIOOS, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network. CIOOS is a mobile app and web platform created by and for Inuit, providing tools for weather, ice safety, and hunting stories, as well as knowledge transfer and language preservation.
The weather's changing, the ice conditions is changing. When we're driving a snowmobile or walking, we have to think before we get on that ice.
So this one's no good. If you try to pass by through this, you'll lose your snowmobile.
CIOOS puts Indigenous knowledge and observations front and center alongside weather and safety services, including sea ice products, tides, marine forecast, and satellite imagery. This lets hunters share dangerous and changing conditions with their communities using their own language and knowledge systems.
We used to get our information on 5 different websites.
Now with CIOOS, all that information is one place, also with the information from the elders and hunters.
CIOOS includes profiles for wildlife, sea ice, and traditional place names in multiple dialects that are taggable and act as living wikis of Indigenous knowledge. Using the mobile app while you're on the land, posts such as hunting stories and GPS tracks can be recorded and uploaded to CIOOS when you are back in your community.
Oral history has been a big part of the Inuit tradition. Nothing was written, so everybody just had a good memory.
Now, with the CIOOS, we are providing new ways how the Inuit knowledge and science can work together.
CIOOS helps you document the data that has always formed the basis of Indigenous knowledge and mobilize it for use in community-based monitoring, guardian programs, and self-determination in research and environmental stewardship.
With CIOOS, we get to decide how we share our knowledge.
CIOOS is a safe place to share our hunting stories.
As the only social media platform putting Indigenous rights first, CIOOS includes privacy settings tailored specifically for Indigenous knowledge, ensuring that no one can use your data without permission.
You become a hunter because you keep practicing and you follow, and you let the elders take the lead.
You still need your harpoon to stay safe on the ice, and now with CIOOS, you can mobilize your knowledge, connecting hunters, elders, and youth for the benefit of future generations.
I think Inuit clothing, the feathers that we use, and traditional tools combined with technology and the tools of today's modern youth, and you put them together, would be amazing.
Integrating Indigenous ways of knowing with a suite of modern technologies. CIOOS, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network, now available for Android, iPhone, and online at cicoos.org, brought to you by the Arctic Eider Society.
Fantastic. We have a comment in the chat box. Love this. I want to know what the globe was on the hunter's back. So thanks for sharing that, Joel. And
Google Street View.
what was that?
Google Street View of the sea ice. It was the first time there'd been Street View out on the ice at a flow edge and putting.
Okay, fantastic. So, and last but not least, Ken, you're up.
So my name's Ken Paul. I am here in Tilbit, close to the what people know as the St. John River, known as Willistok, and people would know us in this region as Maliseet, which we all know Mi'kmaq term, which translated means those are our handsome cousins over there on the other. I realize I've got to up my presentation game here because that was pretty impressive, some of the presentations and panels that came before me. My world, the thing that I deal with mostly is on the policy and regulatory side of the use of knowledge. What I do in my work is I de-emphasize the whole part about the knowledge and call it an Indigenous knowledge system. I want people to understand that there is, it's a knowledge system that has a methodology behind it, so that people just don't think it's an objectified piece of information that they can take, plug it into their own systems. There's a bunch of things that are embedded within Indigenous knowledge, within Indigenous knowledge systems. There are values that come from our communities. These values, of course, come from our ceremonies and from our understandings and our teachings. It gives us a whole different mindset when we approach use of natural resources. And of course, that can also enter into stories, songs, languages, heritage, and everything else. For us, these are all things that are integrated. When I work with Western scientists from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, from the provinces, from universities, the concepts that they are trying to understand and use now, and there's legislation and regulations about this, things like precautionary approach, be careful, cumulative effects, which is looking at how all things act upon each other. But these are concepts that are embedded within our communities and within our languages, our whole understanding concepts of Indigenous knowledge systems. The other reason why we use Indigenous knowledge systems is that not only is that a way of acknowledging that it's a knowledge system, but it also kind of gives permission to our First Nations rely on modern technology as well. So GIS is Geographic Information Systems, the mapping tools, modernized tool that we can use to help document our knowledge. Drone technology, a way of ground truth. Database systems, a way of managing the data. Modern video equipment, and again, to ground truthing, to interview elders, to interview other knowledge keepers, and to document changes in the ice. Part of the video that we just seen in this past presentation. It's really important also to acknowledge the lack of data sovereignty and data security that is expected from First Nations when we're asked to share our knowledge. Whenever we talk about data sharing agreements, it's usually construed as a one-way, where Indigenous elders are going to share information outward, and it's going to be managed by somebody else. The problem with our Indigenous knowledge and that kind of arrangement is that we actually need that information coming from other people as well. It's part of a partnership and a relationship. We also need ways of trying to protect Indigenous. There are no intellectual property laws that exist, either nationally or internationally, that protects the intellectual property rights of Indigenous communal rights. Therefore, one of the methodologies that we're working with within our nation is development of protocols for communities and for tribal organizations, so that if a proponent comes in and is seeking information, now part of the legislation under the Fisheries Act and the Impact Assessment Act, that there's a step-by-step guide on how to approach the community. And on the community side, we can work, identify experts, technical experts within the community themselves, who would be able to interpret the information needs of the proponent and work with the knowledge keepers in the community, so to make sure that the right people are being engaged, the right information shared out. If there's any other ancillary information that can be stored within the nation itself. We trying to propose this, and the other thing that we're trying to let people understand is that for people that are coming into our communities asking for this information, the information is localized to the nation itself. We can't transplant information from one section of Canada to another. It just doesn't work that way. So whatever comes up with respect to policies and approaches has to be adaptable to work at the community. The whole governance structure that's related to this as well, with respect to data sovereignty. The nation has to do the information, and that information is often used to help with land claims, title claims, and all these other things that are necessary for governing themselves. So we're just looking for that level of respect. I'm glad that Kathy had mentioned the treaties at the beginning of her opening, because that's another thing that's really important. We're working on a nation-to-nation relationship, trying to establish our own governance structures, which includes the management of Indigenous knowledge. So I'm just going to pause there. I just want to raise some of these points to open this up. And yeah, I'll turn it over to my panel. And I'm really impressed with the panelists. And of course, I'd like to thank Albert and Edward for today to witness.
Thank you so much, Ken. You got a little choppy at times there now. So now that we've had a chance to see your wonderful face, I might suggest that you take your camera off so that in case that helps your audio for the rest of the discussion. So thank you all to our speakers. We've had a little taste of some of the work that you're involved with. Stephanie, you spoke to the critical connection between FAIR and CARE. So FAIR speaks to data management, and CARE brings in that critical human element, which is the human world that data management, data flows operate in. So thank you so much for introducing us to CARE. Christine, it was wonderful to hear you speak to our connectivity, how water and the movement of creatures like eels move across boundaries, across territories, and connect us all. Joel, you shared a little bit with us about the importance of community-driven research and how technology like the Google Street View can be partnered with Inuit ways of knowing their world and the way the ice is moving and animal movements. And you talked about the proliferation of platforms. That's certainly a challenge that we all need to kind of work together on. And Ken, you raised these questions of sharing agreements. and the importance of sharing agreements being a two-way street, and how typically they can be a one-way street where elders or knowledge holders are sharing their knowledge out, but it's not reciprocated, and the lack of IP laws that can help ensure data sovereignty, data governance is held within the local community. So thank you all so much for touching on all those things. And what I'd like to now do is present the first question for the panelists to consider. And so that question is, I believe we may actually have a slide prepared. Fantastic, thank you. So CIOOS is a relatively new data sharing initiative, and one of our goals for this discussion series is to absorb lessons learned from established knowledge sharing initiatives. So I wondered if you could share with us what was the need that drove the creation of your knowledge sharing initiative, the one that you're choosing to focus on today, and can you speak to the legal, value, and ethical considerations that shaped those early days? And perhaps I'll ask Joel to start us off.
Sure. Thank you. I guess I kind of jumped the gun and started talking about some of that in the first part there as well. But so I gave you a little bit of a background about kind of what helped initiate that for helping kind of like address some community priorities. But I guess more generally, like for collaborative work across communities, it was there. But when we first got the funding, one of the first things we did was talk to M.P.H Kanatami about, you know, how can we align with this and ensure that it's set up in a way that respects Inuit knowledge frameworks and helps empower communities, and that people own their own data. And, you know, they've set up their Inuit Knowledge Committee. And so this was right before the National Inuit Strategy on Research came out. And we really wanted to figure out how can we align this as a tool to help facilitate the implementation of that strategy. You know, there's a lot of talk about this kind of stuff, and from researchers as well, that they want to do it, but they don't necessarily have the sorts of tools to be able to do that, to really engage Inuit in every stage of the research process, and to ensure that they're, you know, a part of that research, and also that they're owning their own data and that sort of stuff. And so from there, I was consulting with a lot of the regional governments, and so the Nunatsiavut government, Makavik in particular, were there early on to help have these sorts of discussions. And the Nunatsiavut government has now adopted CIOOS as their main tool for ice monitoring, for climate change monitoring, invasive species. And so we have a strong level of confidence that the approach has really met their stringent requirements for all these sorts of things. And so I guess part of going into it, I was aware, you know, coming from an academic background, I did a PhD in biology and math, and that's how I got introduced to Senekilor-Miut. And I have a privileged white guy who had the privilege of being adopted by the community. And when I got my PhD, everyone was like, "Congrats, doctor, but you're still a kindergarten in Inuit Haimai Tukangi, Inuit knowledge." And so they inspired me to give up academics and learn from Inuit hunters for the last 20 years. And so with my colleague, Lucas Iargatangnak, we've been kind of working to try and find ways to bring together Inuit knowledge and science from different perspectives. And so through some of the ongoing work, I've been aware in a lot of cases where academics had set up platforms or even just agreements for certain projects under the pretense that they were protecting Indigenous knowledge. But at the end of the day, it was really them protecting their academic interests, and they were either a paywall or they were blocking that, where, you know, elders had contributed interviews that, you know, people they talked about a lot of different things in addition to what the focus of that research project was, because they wanted youth in the community to be able to see that and have that documented for them in the future and that sort of thing. And so under the guise of some of these intellectual property things, a lot of academics were actually getting in the way of helping allowing you to own and control their data. And so, any of the platforms that were being kind of set up. And so the idea was, how can we approach this from a way that really does provide for a number of different scenarios for Inuit to control their own data, and to also respect things that, you know, there's different levels of organization between individuals and communities and regional organizations that need to be a part of those sorts of decisions. And so I think we came up with a pretty simple and universal way. We were thinking, you know, it was developed by and for Inuit, but we've been working with Cree and James Bay, and there's been a lot of interest in CQ from other Indigenous groups, and it's been built to scale in this same sort of framework. And the idea is there's two approaches. One is the terms of reference in the privacy policy. You know, all that text when you join Facebook or whatever that you don't read and you just press I agree. That's really important in this context, and we spent a lot of time thinking about that, making it easy to understand, and also kind of flipping the framework. So even though our charity, the Arctic Eider Society, has developed CQ platform and done the programming and stuff, we don't own any of the data that's contributed to it whatsoever. Inuit own all of their own data. So we're just stewards of the platform to create new tools and to facilitate people owning it, but we can't use any of the data without permission, and neither can any other group. And so the idea was to set that up so that, you know, there's a trade-off here between a lot of what people want from a social perspective, especially around like ice and language. You know, people want everyone to see that Aputangnak, it's where the currents washed the ice out, but it snowed on top of it, and it looks safe, but it's very dangerous. And we want everybody to know where that is and understand that language and make it as accessible as possible. But your secret berry picking spot from the fall, you might not want everyone to know where it is when you're about to go out berry picking. And so, like, how do we balance those trade-offs between making some information very accessible through like this social networking framework, but also helping protect? And so the platform terms of reference overall mean that if you sign up for it and you see something, you can see it, but it doesn't mean that you can use it for your own research without permission. And so there's the first vetting process that you're agreeing to respect Indigenous knowledge, that it's a safe space. Like even on Facebook, there was a young Inuk hunter who hunted a bowhead whale and was bullied on Facebook for it. That's not tolerated. It needs to be a safe space for Indigenous peoples to share their hunting stories on CQ. No fake news is one of them, and it's all around self-determination and people owning their own data. And so then once you agree to that and you're on a post-by-post basis, so you have the mobile app, it works offline, you can make posts about wildlife or ice, and for each post you can determine whether you want it to be accessible to anybody in your community or in other communities that are on CQ. And so there's two ways. One is on the location side. So CQ is like Facebook, except it has a map and the timeline. So time and space kind of linked together. And you can say, I want to show it on the map, or I want to hide it altogether, or I want to have an in-between where it's kind of like when you're booking on Airbnb, you get like a circle and you can determine how big the circle is. And so you get approximately where the location is. And so you can set that in your default so it applies to all the posts you make, or you can change it on a post-by-post basis. And the same thing happens for the feed. So in the feed, what you see in the feed is like Yanni went on a hunting trip, or Yanni caught a beluga, and it shows his name and a featured photo. And then there's a more details button. And so if you set it to low privacy, anybody can click that low more details button and they can see what the animal was, the gender, how big it was, pictures of the stomach contents and that sort of thing, depending on what kind of post it might be. But if you say medium, then only people that are tagged in the post or that are members of a project that you've contributed the post to can see that post. And high security, nobody can even see it in the feed unless they're a member. And so between those two things, there's basically every combination of privacy that people can choose in a simple and informed way about how they share their information. And then I'll wrap up just by saying, on the data stewardship side of things, you own all your own data. And, you know, even other platforms that are out there now that have said, you know, full ownership, access and control by Inuit. But people in town wanted to get their data from that platform and they don't know how to do it. Like, how do I get my own data? I collected it for you, but like, and so on CIOOS, there's a dashboard. The same way as a project has a dashboard, every individual has a dashboard. You can see every single post that you've ever created. You can download them, you can manage them, edit them. It's all there in an accessible way for you as an individual to control. If you join a project, and in the terms of use, a project, which would be like a research project that has to get their licensing, they have to get permits, ethics review, whatever the case might be, depending on the regional Indigenous governance structures, you have to respect all of the existing Indigenous governance structures to create a project on CIOOS and have all of your licensing in place. And so that happens outside of CIOOS through the normal process, but our terms enforce that you have to do that. And then if someone joins a project as a member on CIOOS, it applies that you've done your diligence for that. And then when you are a member of a project and you tag the project in a post, you're assigning a non-exclusive license to that project to use the information from that post for the project. And so it ensures a simple way as a hunter, you can be out, you know what projects you're working for, and you just tag them same way as you tag anything on Facebook in that post. And at the end of your post, it confirms that you're stewarding the data to that project. And so despite, you know, it being a kind of, there's so many different governance structures and there's so many different subtleties around Indigenous knowledge and how you might want to share it in different contexts. I think this kind of simple framework has really driven an approach that works in all the different situations and allows people to have full control and access to their information. So.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Joel. You touched on a lot there. I mean, how you're managing access. I mean, you talk about a simplified system, and I'm sure, you know, that's and I think I'd like to learn more about that. But I'm sure there's been a tremendous amount of work going into to finding that approach that really you know, is community driven, and you know, the technological level that you've brought to this app is quite incredible. So lots to dig into there, and thank you for sharing that fantastic summary. We've got some wonderful comments in the chat here, emphasizing the importance of place-based knowledge. There's interest, Joel, in how, you know, community trust is built, and this question of how you balance reliance on an app and oral knowledge. But I would like to turn things over to Stephanie to share a bit more. Stephanie, if you wanted to share a bit more about CARE and the system, the sort of the human system that CARE creates around sort of the technical work of FAIR, that would be wonderful. I believe, if I did my research correctly, CARE, you know, I have 2008 or 2018 in my head, but could you tell us a little bit more about what led to you spearheading the development of these CARE principles?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to drop in some links in the chat if it lets me. Last time it didn't. But so the CARE principles actually came out in September of 2019. So they haven't been out for that long, but the drivers behind the creation of the CARE principles really were twofold, really concerns about secondary use of data and limited opportunities for benefit sharing. And so trying to work through the tensions between protecting Indigenous rights and interests in Indigenous data and knowledge systems and supporting participation in open data, broad data sharing, big data initiatives. And so the CARE principles really empower Indigenous peoples by shifting the focus from this regulated consultation to value-based relationships. And I think that the key there is that relationships point, and really positioning data approaches within Indigenous cultures and knowledge systems to the benefit of Indigenous peoples. So as many speakers have noted, we need more tools to be doing that. And once we release the care principles, you can't just set forth criteria without thinking through what that means for implementation. And so, we're particularly concerned about co-optation of the care principles and using them in name only, and not being able to evaluate how others are operationalizing them. And so some of the next steps and current projects that we have going on to think through this is to design what we're temporarily calling care criteria for implementation, or a set of indicators for the principles, and for each principle that indicates prioritization of the components. So which principles and which actions you take are essential to realizing the people and purpose behind data, which might be just important to use but are not essential, and which are useful to use but not essential as well. And then really thinking through what are the training needs that and the various elements of training that are needed by different populations, so by rights holders, Indigenous nations, in order to support Indigenous governance efforts, but also by other stakeholders, so repositories or government entities and so forth. And I want to hit on a couple of things that others have touched on too, is how do we promote and create alternative licensing and agreement systems that support communities in their engagement with external data systems? How do we expand mechanisms for provenance and permission and protocols within external data systems? So these are things like data standards, the use of metadata labels, and then how do we really push forward so that we're able to share and understand the tools that people are using? So when we talk about CICOO, what are the data sharing or other mechanisms that they're using within the system to protect and promote Indigenous self-determination? How can we share those with each other so that we're able to leverage those and address the need also that it is not a one-way path for data sharing? We're not just always giving our knowledge into these other systems, but we're also able to access and find other knowledges to incorporate into our own systems. And so really being able to highlight and share and access those tools is super important. And I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So interesting to hear that you are working on these tools for evaluating through indicators the application of care principles, so that they don't become sort of a, like you said, co-opted or become a sort of a tokenistic element to any kind of data sharing initiative. So I'm interested in learning more about that in time. Christine, did you want to speak to this question? As I mentioned in the chat, there's been a lot of conversation about the importance of place-based knowledge, and certainly one, but not the only educational resource that Native Land Digital is known for is this traditional territory map. I just think that there's a lot involved there when we talk about sort of place-based knowledge and concerns about decontextualization when you digitize and share Indigenous knowledge, and anyone in any place of the planet can sort of pluck it off an online platform and have access to it. So I wonder whether you wanted to share anything about the work that Native Land does, and if there's any sort of burning legal or value or ethical considerations that you would like to share with us now.
Sure, absolutely. So to give a very brief background on Native Land Digital, so it was started in the winter of 2014 by a non-Indigenous person who, when standing alongside Indigenous activists at pipeline protests, began to wonder about ways that he could create a platform that would help people to better understand that deeper history of the land that we call home. So quite often, people are simply unaware. It's not necessarily history that we've been taught to appreciate, per se. So essentially, native land was born out of kind of a convergence of activism, of cartographic skill, and of a knowledge of ways to encourage educational conversation. So fast forward to kind of present day, 5 years later. So Indigenous people form the governance structure of Native Land Digital, as well as all of our staff are Indigenous, and we're supported by an advisory council made up of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks too. So really, what Victor Temprano had done was set up an organization that allowed space for Indigenous people to govern the way that our territories were mapped. And so, looking at the amount of information that we have on native land right now, so we have over 3,000 shapes that are in over 30 different countries, and we can have up to I don't know, we have tens of thousands of people who visit the website per day. So we have this incredible responsibility to ensure not only that information is appropriate, but rather that the information that we have on our map is that which is based in Indigenous or tribal community or nation-based knowledge. So really, we only share the information that communities have essentially given permission to put out into the world. And part of, I think, the more ethical conversation is that if there's anything that needs to be changed or added to or fixed or removed, we're able to respond quickly to change that information as needed. And further, if we do have any issues that we encounter, we draw on the knowledge of elders within our own communities or elders that have offered to guide us through these more difficult situations. So with that, we do try to do our work with a good heart and from a very good place. The thing I should mention too is that Native Land Digital is never meant to be used for legal purposes whatsoever. We do err on the side that we are a constant work in progress, and that we are able to respond to the needs of the nations that are present on the map itself. And further, we do have open data policy where people can use the information that's found on Native Land Digital. We do ask that people kind of let us know if they are hoping to use the information that we put out into the world. So, I mean, all in all, it's kind of based on making sure that things are done from a good place and being accountable to each other and to the Indigenous nations who are involved.
Thanks, Christine. And you touched on a topic for one of my next questions, which has to do with sort of access and how access is managed and why it's important. So you've spoken to the native land as being sort of a more of on the open access side of the spectrum. But I wonder whether we might flick to the next slide, please. And my next question really has to do with more managing of access, and a number of our guest speakers have already touched on that. So I'm also cognizant of making sure I want to get to our last question. But so perhaps to this next question, you might keep your responses succinct. And I would like to start with Ken, but the question is, data sharing exists along a spectrum between open and closed. And by open, I mean that anyone can access it. And by closed, I mean that only the original data collectors or data holders, that organization or peoples, have access to it. Where along the spectrum would you locate your knowledge sharing approach if you're choosing to focus on one today? And how do you manage access? Why is that important? So Ken, I wonder whether you might be able to speak to this question in your work with the Wolastoqey First Nation.
Yeah. Okay, so when I'm coming back, I got to talk again about the protocols that we're promoting, that we're trying to develop. A protocol will give sort of, I guess, sort of step-by-step what a proponent would need to do to get information from a First Nation. And if it's done properly, it will require the proponent to write a proposal along with an application fee. There's also this underappreciation that the knowledge of our that our knowledge keepers have, and the people that are working in our tribal organizations and in our First Nations are just willing to go along with this. There's no appreciation for the actual cost that is associated with this, because people have to pay bills, people still have to pay the heat in their houses and things like that. So it's important to actually have investments. When the request comes in, then it should be assessed by a community, a group that's assigned by the community. They'll identify the technicians that will go and work with the elders and the knowledge keepers, and they will be able to boil down the information that's required of the proponent. And as I mentioned before, all the other information that's shared in those forums internally managed by the First Nation. The reason why this is important is because there are often times that information was just taken from the community and never shared back. I think we've all somewhat aware of that kind of dynamic. The other problem that we're trying to alleviate is that the information is not going to be misused. There are many cases where information was shared on a specific project. It was shared throughout a federal department or through academic journals, stuff like that. It was picked up by somebody else who never understood the context and have used that against the community itself. For example, one of the things that we need this information for in our Native communities is to establish land claims. It's because working with land claims and land title, you have to prove occupancy and use according to Canada's court systems. So in order to appease Canada's courts, we have to understand and take these very careful steps to do that. There are methodologies to help us along those lines. Another thing that is really important related to, like we all saw the horror of what happened last fall in St. Mary's Bay with respect to the lobster. People don't understand the context that Sadaganagati was just trying to go out and fish under their inherent rights and under their treaty protection rights. That's what they saw, but people don't understand that they actually had a lobster management plan that they have been developing over the last 3 years. The data that they would be collecting when they brought in their lobster catch will go into that plan. So when any First Nation is going out to assert itself to deal with natural resources, we also have to have management plans in place. A big part of the management plan is our own Indigenous knowledge, our own science, and our own approach. So these are the things that are very important to us. The data sharing agreements should outline what the information that's shared outward can be used for, in what context, and these are legal binding documents. There has to be a formality around like the data sharing itself to ensure that there's protection and the integrity of the information will not be used against First Nations, and that there's information that's shared out will be used for a specific purpose.
Ken, are you there? We lost you.
I'm still here.
Okay.
I just stopped talking.
Okay. Can you got real garbled in that last 10 seconds. Can you just repeat what you said, please?
Oh, recreate the magic.
That's right.
I thought, okay, so I think I was just mostly talking about the fact that the protocols are legal binding documents. They're really important to have in place so that the information, the data that's being shared outward from the community is being used for its intended purposes and not being misused later on to work against the First Nation that's sharing it out.
Thank you. That's beautifully said. Appreciate you repeating yourself. So protocols, and I mean, Joel, you've touched on terms of references and privacy policy. that's attached to CIOOS. Can you speak briefly to, is there anything additionally like you'd like to share regarding how access is managed through CIOOS and why that's important?
Yeah, I guess I kind of covered a lot of the basics. I mean, there's complex questions in many cases about, you know, who represents communities, a combination of the municipality and the hunters support programs, and you know, and around data, that does the individual own that rights to that data, or is it more of a collective data owned by the community? And we don't suppose to solve those sorts of problems, but through the framework have a way to respect that. And so the one type of stewardship I didn't mention was there's an Indigenous stewardship option on posts there as well. And so we talked about individuals, they own all their own data and control it and can download it anytime. And just kind of reflecting some of Ken's comments there too, the same sort of thing, right? Researchers came up and they did interviews, or the data was stuck in file cabinets down south, never to be returned, sort of thing. And so the way we've been getting at that is that the data is available throughout the course of the project and accessible to the community members, like as the project's progressing. So it's not like at the end you have to kind of like try and get it all back for the community, that is being contributed and accessible to the community on an ongoing basis. And so like you need to get a letter of support from a community, as well as your regional permits and stuff to do research in Nunavut and similar sorts of things in other parts of Inuit and Nunavut. And so under project stewardship, that's pretty clear. And so if someone then came down the road and wanted to request data, then they would still have to go back and get their licensing, and they would have to talk to the community. And it's possible that the people that originally contributed the data might not be around anymore, they might have passed on, but they really did want that to be a part of an archive of their community's knowledge that the community can use. Maybe it's as simple as students at a school wanting to use a video of interviews in a school project, or maybe it's more complicated where it's there's another project coming in and they want to incorporate knowledge that's been documented before. And so the third stewardship option on CIOOS is around Indigenous stewardship, and that basically the simple wording is that I agree, I want this to be stewarded for the benefit of my community in the long term, and I give my community and representatives permission to make informed decisions that this can be used for the benefit of my community. And so it's a bit of a forward-thinking license. It doesn't mean that anyone can come in and use that data. Like, so a mining company couldn't just come in or whatever and just say, I want to use it, and they'd have access. It would still need to go through the regional, like community representation would have to approve the project, and they'd have to get permitting from the regional organizations and stuff too. So it still allows those sorts of checks and balances to be in place, but for people to proactively share that data, so it's kind of there for future generations, sort of thing as well. And so, yeah, I guess like the question about where along the spectrum of being open and closed to CIOOS lie, and I think it's kind of the full spectrum, I guess. I wouldn't say it's really open, because, you know, you can see stuff and it can be shared, but you can't use any of it without permission and some sort of licensing. So it's not fully open in that way. We are working on another option, like third-party stewardship, that would allow just metadata without your name. It would be like the date, time, and location and wildlife species, that if someone wanted to contribute it to another platform like eBird, it would allow users to make that decision. And so it would still be limited, but that would allow it to be to kind of like contribute to these bigger scale biodiversity sorts of efforts. So if you saw like a new bird species that showed up and you made a post on CIOOS and you said, I want to share this with other platforms, just the very basic metadata, that it would allow that to happen. So there could be those links with other platforms like iNaturalist and eBird and those sorts of things. And so, yeah, but none of that is really open, and so people and everywhere else in kind of between, people can kind of make their own decisions about how open they want it to be, whether it be around the location or the ability to view it in the first place, and how that might be stewarded by projects and their representatives in the longer term.
Thanks, Joel. So yeah, interesting. Open, but so you can access information, but you can't use it or apply it without getting the permissions of the knowledge holders. And Christine, your native land map, I think, sort of falls onto the open end of the spectrum, where you sort of acknowledge that territories and boundaries are shifting all the time, and that you welcome updates and insights from people to continue to evolve the map. What does sort of this more open access approach that you've taken allow you to do, or does it open things up, or does it make things more complicated?
So the way that I kind of approach this question, I have an answer as, with Native Land Digital, and then I also have an answer as an Indigenous person. So for Native Land Digital, it's important to note that we do not have any cultural or ancestral information necessarily on the map, unless it is something that communities or nations have given us permission to do explicitly. And so even when it comes to, say, sharing language or language translations, that's something that we approach very carefully. And having an open source, open source information, I think that we do put a lot of faith into the people who use the map, that they will do good with the map. And so far, any instances that we know of have been used to help raise awareness that the land throughout Turtle Island is Indigenous land, Turtle Island and beyond. But I do have a few other comments that I want to make, just on a personal level, when it comes to sharing any of the knowledge that I have relearned in my community. So I belong to a community and a nation that's been deeply impacted by colonization, and I grew up not really knowing our stories or traditions or cultures, and have spent most of my life trying to relearn just a very small portion of that knowledge. And then for myself, in knowing the kind of the legacy of that lack of knowledge, and as well as the amount of work that it's taken to relearn that knowledge, I'm hesitant to share outside of my community. So for me, the priority remains in the community, in the nation, and making sure that those next generations do not grow up wondering who they are or where they're from or the ways that we interacted with land and so on. So for me, encouraging community resurgence is my priority on a personal level. But I do also want to mention that it's important to consider that when anyone is asking anyone who is non-Indigenous, or even Indigenous people conducting research in other communities, just to kind of approach with respect and humility. So even this morning, I had a request from someone saying, hey, can you send me some lore of your community so I can publish it in a book and then make profit off of that? So then I am then left to sit with that and think of, what are the ways that I can respectfully tell this person that those are not their stories to tell, but instead they belong to the community. So I just encourage folks that when you are asking for Indigenous people to share that information, not only to take into consideration the policies and the principles that have been shared by my co-panelists here, but also take the time to educate yourself on even proper protocol for asking, for knowing what is appropriate to ask and what is not appropriate to ask. Really because it's a lot of work trying to explain to someone, no, I'm sorry, I can't tell you these things because they belong within my community, and I can't share those ancestral stories with you because they belong within. So just kind of wanted to add that point to the discussion as well.
Thank you very much. So our final question, I would like to first direct to Stephanie, and I have a very brief preamble first. So as many of you know, the discussion series was launched on January 19th, and we heard from two elders who have joined us on the call today, Elder Albert Marshall and Elder Edward Purley. And they spoke to the need for a transformative change in how we collaborate to ensure the Earth's health and its survival, and also spoke to the idea that the two-eyed seeing is action-oriented. So I'm wondering if our speakers today can share with us examples of how Indigenous and Western knowledge have been brought together and have resulted in sustained action. And Stephanie, I know that CARE is, like you said, those principles were just published in 2019. Wondering if you can give us a tangible example of somebody who's taking those principles and putting them into action, or if you wanted to share some other example in the work that you've been engaged with throughout your career and life.
Thank you, Christina. So I think what I'd actually like to share, so like I said, the CARE principles came out in 2019, and they're in the early stages of implementation. We don't yet have succinct criteria for evaluation of the implementation of them. But many pre-existing efforts practice CARE. And I think, you know, there's the traditional knowledge labels that have come out of local contexts at localcontext.org, and some new biocultural labels that are moving forward. And what these do, which kind of touch on our discussion that just happened around how open and closed things are, is really try to embed relational protocols within data systems and across data life cycles, as well as embed provenance within the systems. And so provenance really is a fancy word that refers to the trail or the story of the history and the origin of the data. And so really relates it back to the Indigenous communities from which it comes. And so, you know, those are one tangible pre-existing item there. The other thing I want to highlight as well is that is the work of Dr. Kelsey Leonard, who served as a tribal co-leader for the former Mid-Atlantic Regional Planning Body here in the US under our National Ocean Council. And she really, since maybe 2013 or 2014, advocated and instituted change in collaboration with the team to confront Indigenous erasure by literally having to have Indigenous nations appear on the map first. So once they appeared on the map for that effort, their rights and interests really became integral to the moving forward, especially in the creation and the protocols for their Mid-Atlantic Ocean data portal. And so she recently actually wrote a blog post that talks about the application of CARE in mapping and observing efforts. And she speaks eloquently to the need to promote equitable outcomes for collective benefit and how that interacts with the data portal that they set up, respecting and recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, becoming champions for Indigenous language and worldviews, and really building capacity for the kind of utilizing the knowledge systems from the communities and the people who are contributing data and using data from elsewhere in tandem with and building capacity for Indigenous technology design and cartography, so that we can endow future generations to be able to utilize their own Indigenous knowledge systems, as well as these data and GIS ecosystems to benefit their communities and everybody, really.
Thank you, Stephanie. And you've you've included the link to that blog by Kelsey Leonard in the chat box. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Christine or Joel, would either of you like to briefly, if you can, share an example of how in your work, Western and Indigenous knowledge systems have been brought together for action that is protecting our Earth for the future generations?
Who would you like to go first?
Joel, why don't you kick us off, and Christine, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, if you after Joel.
Sure. Well, why don't I start with the example I gave about Peter Katuk, our elder who recently passed away, and where we're at now. We launched CIOOS a year ago, and Lucas Ergatangnak presented at the Arctic Change meeting. We have a video on our Facebook page and YouTube page where he kind of goes through that whole thing. And now we've had hunters throughout the community documenting the seals that they've been catching, and showing how there's seasonal trends in the changes in diets that affect the trophic level that seals are feeding at. And that, you know, if this is funded through the Northern Contaminants Program, who approached us, and how can we better incorporate Inuit Haimai-Tukangi into research on contaminants work. And so now, because of, if seals are shifting their diet to different trophic levels, that potentially affects the pathway for contaminants to go through the food web, to seals, to polar bears, to people, sort of thing. But it can also affect the mixed models for researchers. And so I encourage you to watch that talk by Lucasy. We're really proud of it because it's the first kind of like Inuit at every stage from beginning to end, really showing how we can use CIOOS as a tool to implement the National Inuit Strategy on research. All the data was collected by Inuit hunters and presented by Lucasy and designed by Lucasy and Peter Katuk. So that's a really good example there. We also have on our CIOOS project management page, there's a video case study for Hecate. During the pandemic in Seneca-Illuak, we have 200 people that have signed up for CIOOS. 100 of them have been making posts, and instead of bringing in researchers to study fish, the community, those 100 people, men, women, elders, youth, during the pandemic when researchers couldn't come in, they documented over 5,000 fish that were brought in, whether they're landlocked or sea run from the photos, whether they were eating sticklebacks or shrimp, how big they were. And we basically crowdsourced a resource inventory for the protected area. And this is kind of the approach where Inuit can really help in establishing protected areas, and it's been designed for guardians programs and how this can contribute to the management plans, and having Inuit really drive those sorts of guardians and protected areas sorts of initiatives. And I wanted to end on something that we're really excited about right now. The ICE terminology, we're talking about the language side of it too, right? And by, you know, one thing, having the traditional place names on the map and the GPS for CIOOS is huge. They've been available for a while, but it's not until you have them offline and you're on the land and you see it, and that's where you are, that you remember it. And those place names aren't just names. They have a story, and they have the name implies a lot of the meaning and what's important for that place. And the same for Inuktitut sea ice terminology, right? It's more advanced than the Canadian Ice Services classification system for shipping. And it's more relevant to communities, how you walk on it, how people use the ice, how wildlife use the ice. And so it's more than just words. It's a whole classification system that's even more detailed than science. And those words are some of the words that are most at risk at getting lost in Inuktitut languages. And so even more than that, they're the foundation for Inuit knowledge and Inuit Haimai-Tukangi frameworks, right? It's a framework for that. And by being able to make a post and tag it and associate the date, time, location, weather, photos around that, it's empowering elders or hunters that had been forgetting that language to use it, to use that to quantitatively use their own knowledge frameworks to document environmental change. And right now, we just released a product called the CIOOS Ice Map that brings together the Canadian ice service charts, as well as processing of radar imagery that shows how rough the ice is, on the landfast ice, and a layer of Inuit ice posts showing where it's dangerous and mobilizing their language. And we like to joke around a little bit to say that, you know, it's white people are never going to understand. And so it's going to be easier to teach machine learning algorithms about Inuit knowledge than it is to teach Southern researchers. And, you know, getting by this kind of direct connection to digital, allowing Inuit to contribute to ground truthing and training data to help provide classification systems for, in this case, ice terminology that will help train automation of radar that can see through the clouds and in the dark, identifying ice hazards in the long term and classifying ice in an Inukshuk framework. So I think there's some really exciting ways that this technology is going to facilitate Inuit knowledge and technology working together and science.
Thank you, Joel. I did want to pass it over to Christine, but Christine, we've got a really interesting question in the chat here, and maybe you want to take a stab at it. R. Tedeman, would you like to unmic yourself and present the question to the guest panelists?
Hi, Christine. Just when you were speaking about the idea of sharing knowledge, and I recognize that the type of knowledge we're talking about can be different at different times. And I'm only asking this from a standpoint of humbleness and with respect. But I think that the Indigenous worldview is really necessary for the world to adopt in order to be able to have that transformative change that we're talking about. And so with that in mind, would it not be necessary for knowledge holders to kind of be responsible for sharing that knowledge in order to inspire that change and that movement?
Thank you for your question. And I did see it pop up in the chat, so I've been kind of thinking about it. And again, I only speak with my own perspective and my understanding as Mcrae. I do think that many knowledge holders, knowledge keepers, and elders share a lot. And they share what it is that they feel needs to be shared at a certain point in time, and they have their own agency to do that. And so I think that at least I will say most of the elders that I have met, I trust that the amount of knowledge that they're willing to share and the actions that they take are that which they think is appropriate to share and to make the world a better place. So I don't think that it is the responsibility of knowledge keepers to share everything that they know, but rather what is appropriate at any given time.
Ken, or would you like to add to that? Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, well, I agree with Christine that our knowledge keepers have been sharing. They're like our peoples. The reasons why there's even non-Indigenous peoples here in North America is because our ancestors and our elders shared. They never felt threatened. They shared the land. They shared the knowledge. There's, you know, you can read the logs from Samuel de Champlain that they would have died completely if they had not learned about how to live here by Indigenous peoples. Problem that we have nowadays is that people keep taking from our elders and keep taking from our nations. They take our traditions, they take our languages, and they use that for their own purposes without benefits coming back. This is one of the reasons why I keep promoting this thing about protocols. These are things that are going to help facilitate the sharing. We know that there's an environmental crisis here. We know that there's Western science, which has a lot of value. Like, don't get me wrong, there's tremendous value in Western science, but it's not the be all and end all. It's not like a universal approach. It's not something that can be used on solving every single problem. So responsibility of just knowledge keepers sharing, I'm not really so sure about phrasing it that way. There's this willingness to do this, but there's a responsibility amongst the people that are receiving the knowledge to actually respect it and use it respectfully, and not use it and not only do it solely for personal gain. So that would be my response to that kind of approach.
Thanks, Ken. I would like to take another question from the audience before we're out of time here. There are a couple that are older that are goodies. If anyone wants to pop something in now, that's your chance. Now is your chance. I'll give that 5 seconds to pop it into the chat, or if you want to unmic yourself and ask directly to our panelists, please do so. So we had a question earlier on that emerged out of Joel's, one of the points Joel was making, but I think it has relevance to all of the topics that our guest speakers have spoken to. And that was a question regarding this balance between relying too much, and this is from Luisa Ramirez. She says, fantastic work. I wonder if there has been any discussion concerns about relying too much on an app and whether oral knowledge and the ability of reading nature could be eroded. And Elder Albert Marshall spoke to the importance of oral knowledge at the beginning of this session, and a number of our guest speakers have touched on it throughout the discussion. So Stephanie, would you like to start with that? Would you like to speak to that? Or Joel? So Stephanie, why don't you go first, and then we'll conclude with Joel, and then I have a couple concluding remarks too, and I'd like to try and get us to end on time, more or less.
Yeah, I think this question too kind of links back to what are the needs and the desires of the communities in which these applications are being used. How do we make sure that we're we're having these conversations so that we're, as I think Ken has so aptly and said, respecting protocols, right? Embedding the ways of being and doing that we've always had within communities within our digital applications, but also recognizing that there is a definite need for continuing our oral knowledge and the application of those oral knowledge systems. But I think I can't remember if it was Elder Albert or who said it earlier in our call today, but recognizing too, we're in this transition period, the entire global community is in this transition period, right, to digital technologies, and how are we relating to and becoming part of these systems as Indigenous peoples. And so not to be fetishized really as this, as being left in the past, right? And that we're only behaving in these past ways, but we have these new ways of interacting with each other, and that can be adopted and utilized as communities see fit, and can complement ongoing oral systems of engagement and sharing knowledge, and really working with the systems that we've always had within our communities. And so I think as part of this, I see a lot of times we have these either or these ongoing tensions between doing it one way or the other, right? But it is really this kind of two-eyed seeing approach of how do we make sure that we're adhering to the ways that communities want to be engaging with themselves, right, and with other communities, and being able to utilize the approaches as they see fit. So really situating within that self-determination, and situating within the protocols and the purposes for use of knowledge within communities.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Joel, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to speak to that. But before you do, Ken's just notified me that he has to leave promptly at 3, as others of you may have to do. He's got a Zoom call with his chiefs. So if we could just a round of applause for Ken before he leaves. Thank you so much, Ken, for joining us today and for bringing your perspectives to the discussion. Really appreciate it. So Joel, bye, Ken. Joel, you've got 30 seconds and then I'm going to take the mic back and we're going to run probably about 15 minutes over time. So my apologies in advance for those. I hope you can stick on for 15 more minutes, but if you have to leave, you have to leave. Joel.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In the CQ trailer, Candace says, you still need your harpoon to stay safe on the ice. And I think that was a key part that, you know, it's not meant to replace those oral history mechanisms. It's meant to help preserve language. And, you know, Inuit are still going to learn by watching, and you can't learn to use your harpoon with the CQ app. But it's getting youth that are addicted to like games like PUBG to be interested in using the app to get out on the ice to learn from their elders. And it's getting youth out there to video and take photos and record stories from their elders that can be shared with others in the community to get them interested. And so it's not in any way meant to replace that. It's meant to help support that. And there's been a lot of elders that have been excited about that approach as well. And so I could talk a bit more about that, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Joel. We're scratching the surface here, but I do appreciate all of our guest speakers for sharing what they can in this period of time, and I certainly CIOOS Atlantic, we're hoping this is the beginning of many discussions, and I hope that any of our attendees here who have been excited or want to learn more about any of the initiatives that our guest speakers have spoken to can follow up and have some ongoing conversations with you to dig deeper. So it's just 3 o'clock now. I have a couple concluding remarks, but before we do that, could we please have a round of applause for all of our guest speakers today? Thank you all, wherever you are. Thank you so much. That was I've learned a lot, and I hope you all have too. So, Katherine, before I conclude, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share your concluding remarks. So if you would like to take the microphone, that would be fantastic.
Of course, there's a phone ringing in the background as you tell me to do this. I'd like to thank everybody for being here. The conversations, you know, they had me feeling anxious and happy and back to anxious. And I've really enjoyed listening to, oh, I don't see her on my list, the one who talks about the digital.
Christine Mcrae, Native Land Digital?
Yeah, I was proud to hear how she spoke about, you know, how careful she is, and as a young person, how she's relearning and protects that, and that makes me happy. I also feel that, as Albert said, you know, when the new immigrants, the British came, they took away the rights, took away our abilities to do the work we are supposed to always be doing, which is being the caretakers of the earth, and making sure we live in according to the way of life that we're taught to live. So when I think about that, I think, you know, because we lost so much opportunity to teach people over hundreds of years the way it is, we're now being, actually many people are in academia included, sciences, are respecting our ways, and we have a lot to share, but it's just it's difficult to decide how much to share, when to share, and who to share it with. But it is our role to take care of the earth, and as Albert talks to us a lot about, is to live with the understanding of being living with Nedigalimk, where you only take what you need and what you need to provide for your family. So I thought a lot about what everybody's saying, and although I was anxious sometimes, it's just because I've come from probably 40 years of people stealing, taking, disrespecting, never acknowledging, not even acknowledging that they took anything. So it's been, you know, it's been a good day to listen to all of you. So are you saying for me to end this, or you're going to say a few more words? How do you want this, Christina?
Yes, thanks, Catherine, for those reflections. I do have a few more words, and then it would be wonderful if you could sing us out. So
Okay.
if I could just take a few more minutes. Thank you, attendees, for your patience. I know we're over time here. So we have taken a dive today into some of the legal, ethical, and value considerations when digitizing and sharing Indigenous knowledge. And CIOOS is committed to deepening our understanding of best practices and local protocols, which our guest speakers have spoken to, how critical those are, as well as continuing to have conversations with Indigenous peoples and organizations in Atlantic Canada to discuss where and how we might partner. We've certainly learned that not all knowledge can or should be made open. And CIOOS has started a new collaboration with Canada's Ocean Supercluster called Vitality. And there, through conversations and surveys, we are continuing to explore how sensitive and restricted data, how awareness of that kind of sensitive and restricted data can be increased while ensuring ownership and control is maintained by the data holder. One aspect of Vitality is training. And Stephanie, you spoke to the importance of training. And so Vitality is seeking to explore what, if any, training is needed or would be helpful for those who work with coastal and ocean data to better support people in stewarding their own data. So I do encourage you to please check out the Vitality website. And if I have that, I should have that handy here. I'm going to pop that into the discussion, the chat box right now. So please do take a look if you're interested in learning more about Vitality or some of the training that we're going to be offering. Here we go. In goes the link. And there's contact information there if you do want to learn more, or you're very welcome to reach out to any one of us here at CIOOS Atlantic. Our third and final discussion in the series is taking place on February 16th from 1 to 3 p.m. We'll be hearing about the factors that contribute to successful collaborations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and organizations. And we have some more fantastic guest speakers lined up to share regional, national, and international perspectives on coastal and ocean work. So I hope to see you there, and thank you all so much for your interest today and for holding this space for discussion. So Catherine, if you would sing us out, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Yo ya he ya he yo. Thank you, Great Spirit, for thunder in the sky. Thanks for the seasons that are part of life. Thanks for the daytime and for the night. And thanks for the way of our lives. Yo ya ye ya yo ya ye. Yo ya ye ya yo ya ye. Yo ya ye ya yo ya ye. Yo ya ye ya yo. Yo ya ya yo. Doho. I'm sitting Okama. Love this. See you.
Thanks, Catherine.